Well, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome in from across the continent and beyond today for another exciting Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants broadcast. I know we've got some familiar faces in the crowd, but if you are new to us, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Now, I'm so excited for today, truly, because today marks the beginning of a second series in conjunction with our friends at Wild Hope. Now, Wild Hope I discovered a couple years back, and what they do is showcase and celebrate the coolest, most tangible actions from people working to conserve species and habitats all around the globe. They're so positive. They've got an incredible lineup on PBS and YouTube featuring all their amazing stories. And last year, we joined them for a 10-part broadcast. The most fun things I've ever done in 10 years of doing this at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. So we were really excited to partner with them again. And we reached out to Wild Hope and they said, yes, we're so keen to do a 10-part series. And the first person you have to have on, the best person, this is a true story, is Derek. Derek's going to tell you about his incredible work making a farm go wild in the UK. He's got such a neat story, and I'm so excited to make sure that he comes on your broadcast of everybody. And so today, fulfilling that idea, we are bringing on Derek to tell us a little bit about his incredible work. I'm so excited for you to meet him, and I can't wait to get underway with A Farm Goes Wild. So, Derek, welcome to the program. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you two guys, even at a distance.
Got kids from all over the continent today. I'm going to zip my lip. It's not about me, so I'm going to let you dive in and take us away with this fascinating presentation. I've got to say, people send me their presentations all the time, and this is one of the most visually different ones I've ever seen. So I'm very excited to hear all about it.
And it's got no written explanation, so you're going to have to second guess it as well. If anybody's interested at the end, I don't know if we can do a show of hands. In the kitchen behind me, I've got my new puppy. It came yesterday. It's called Jim. There's one hand up. So providing it doesn't barf all over the screen when we finish, I'll pick him up and you can say hi. Okay, I have two kids. I used to spend a lot of time in cinemas going to kids' presentations, and some of them were very funny and very enjoyable. One of the ones I liked was the Lorax. It was these people, living in a place called Thneedville, surrounded by a big wall with all the happy things that were familiar to them and the surroundings amongst them. The plastic lawns, the bridges, the complete and utter artificiality of a living environment. Next slide. And it wasn't until about halfway through the film that the hero and heroine began to realize that actually this was a completely plastic nonsense that they'd entered their existence around, and that in reality behind that wall was an environment that was grim. The life that had been there, the trees, the animals, the birds, the fish, had all but disappeared from the wider environment, and that really the landscape that they were living in wasn't green and verdant and well lit and pretty. The reality outside the wall was anything but. Next slide. And we've got to understand, when we start to think about nature and the history of nature, I've just come back from a tour of the Midwest, and we went to Montana and Dakota, and we saw many amazing things. And our interaction, in a negative sense with the creatures of this earth is long-standing. When you go to some of the wonderful Indian petroglyph sites that we saw as we came through the landscape, you see things images that go back of beavers and deer. I didn't see any mastodons, unfortunately, but a whole range of creatures that were familiar to them 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, the last of these animals, the mastodons and the woolly mammoths, were still present in North America, and the mammoths at least survived until 4,000 years before the birth of Christ on a wee island called Wrangel Island, where you had these miniature mammoths that were a relic population of their own. Next slide. And we know now in large part that the reasons why these animals disappeared from the different continents, the marsupial lions from Australia, the mastodons and mammoths from North America, the giant ground sloths from South America, was really all because of us. When we developed the technologies, we needed to hunt them, the flint spears, and then increasingly sophisticated weaponry and sophisticated ways of trapping them. These big animals just had no resistance, and it wasn't very long. It isn't very long before we appear in the equation before they disappear. So, if you're thinking, what relevance is that to Britain, then I'll tell you. So Britain is this, it's a strange little island. It's an island full of writers and, I don't know, Buckingham Palace and beef eaters with silly medieval costumes. But it's also an island with stories. And when I was little, one of my favourite stories was Wind in the Willows. This nice rambunctious tale of animals waking their way through a countryside to retake the country mansion of Toad Hall, which has been overtaken by a sneaky bunch of weasels and stoats. And one of the heroes in Wind in the Willows is the water rat or ratty. And when Kenneth Graham wrote the book about 100 odd years ago, that character was still a very familiar animal in the English landscape. Next slide. But, because we've changed the countryside, the rivers and streams have been straightened and infilled, the wetlands have been drained, the farm ponds have been drained, the willows and the trees that we once cut down for a whole range of different reasons, and indeed were cut down by beavers many hundreds of years before us, that ensure that the wetlands are full of flowers and sedges and green vegetation that's open to the sun. All these habitats that this semi-aquatic rodent that builds its burrows in the sides of riverbanks and streams so requires to feed on the vegetation and plants, they've gone. And this animal that was 100 years ago a very common animal is now a very rare animal. It's reckoned the population's collapsed by about 97%. And what we're facing is now its extinction in our lifetime. Next slide. And as I said earlier on, Britain is a small island. So when you look at the United States and Canada and the big continents, you still live in environments where at least somewhere off in the far distance there are free-living bison and wolves in places like Yellowstone and grizzlies. Well, we did these animals to death here probably 300 years ago. And by the time you get to modern continental Europe, countries like France and Germany and Holland and Belgium that are also well developed, the wolf's a thing of the past, and it doesn't return really until the last 20, 30 years with protection. So what we've been very good at doing in Britain, because it's a small island, is smashing out the animals that we just really didn't want. Next slide. And the sad thing about it is that, now in a more intelligent age, when we realize how important these animals are for the natural ecology and, how stupid we've been, in these old mythologies of the paths of Red Riding Hood and this something like the wolf being a creature of dread and fear and superstition, how misplaced that belief was. The thing that's still scary is that some people, even in our countryside today, firmly believe that, big birds like eagles shouldn't be allowed to live because one day they'll eat a lamb or they'll eat a cultivated pheasant, and they're still poisoned and killed even though it's illegal today. Next slide. So my farm it's about 400 acres. It sits in a lovely green county in the west of England called Devon. We're not very far away from Cornwall, where King Arthur's castle sits still on the coast. And when I came here 20 years ago, it was my intention to farm it with beef cattle and sheep. But because I've worked in ecology for many years, over the years that follow, you just got, really quite fed up with what you were doing. I mean, the farm worked well. We had, a lot of calves and a lot of lambs to sell every year. But every year you saw the numbers of curlews or the numbers of meadow pipits, or the numbers of butterflies, or the number of reptiles going down and down and down. And it really, in the end, for me, it became too much. So what I decided to do about 5-6 years ago was to rewild my farm. And I started to look at bringing in groups of animals that weren't going to be conventional domestic animals that had big horns and could knock down trees and dig holes in the ground with their big flat front feet when they were competing with other bulls. And animals like these het cattle, which are a recreation that the Germans made of the animals that became extinct in historic times from the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamara, were one of the first bunches of animals I imported from continental Europe. Next slide. But one of the problems that you will know you have if you're living in an environment where you've lots of big wild animals running around is that it's not so much fun if you hit one with a car on the motorway at night. So these are animals that, when we talk about rewilding, they're all fenced into an area. They're not able to cross roads or highways or infrastructure. In the landscape where I live, there are a lot of red deer. This is obviously the animal in the photographs of moose, but the red deer are big enough things if you hit them at night, cause some real damage to your car. So big wild animals moving through our landscapes now here in Britain are very difficult. Next slide. So, it's easier to deal with animals that are semi-domestic. So the het cattle are a form of cow. The longhorns, Nep Castle in the background, are a form of cow. And why would you keep these? Well, it's important to realize that big animals have big impacts on environments. And even though the wild animals that once produced those impacts are extinct, if you've got cattle at longhorns or het cattle, and you don't put a lot of toxic poisons into them when you're worming them, and you don't have growth promoters in them, then these animals by producing their own weight in dung alone in a year, these animals feed a lot of insects that are reliant on that dung. Addition to that, if they have clean blood, you have many insects that feed on the blood of big animals. And then things like, birds will land on their back to pick off their parasites. And also in the spring, when they're casting their big woolly winter coats to pick off the hair for the snuggly nest. So big animals have all sorts of impacts on little animals. And if you're looking to create areas of land where little animals are going to prosper, then one of the things you have to do is think about bringing back at least a few of the big animals first. Next slide. Because increasingly we live in a farmed landscapes where the idea that there's any room for nature is just absurd. I mean, this is part of the kind of like the old Eastern European wall, which runs right the way through many European countries now and was preserved as this huge green corridor, for nature after the fences and the machine guns came down. But you can see even in this area where you've got a relatively wide band of green and trees, that when you look at the landscape around it, and it's all just cornfields with huge amounts of pesticides and chemical fertilizers on them, then not much else is going to live out there. Next slide. And certainly, one of the best examples of this are that with the intensification of farming, the drainage, the ploughing, the pesticides, the chemicals, all the many toxins there are, is that the wading birds that used to, in the environment around me here on this farm, if you spoke to the old farmers, that used to be the sound of spring, the calling lapwings, the calling curlews, the adults, doing these incredible sky dances in the air to both mate and then to try and persuade any crows that came along to focus on them and not focus on their tiny speckled chicks in the long grass. Then these things are all gone. I mean, there are very, very few of these birds now left on Dartmoor. Maybe there's one pair of curlews, of lapwings, which are a kind of green plover. In the whole of Cornwall and Devon, maybe you've got 6 breeding pairs of these birds left. And this phenomenon that is brought by agricultural change is common to most of the agriculturally industrialized countries. Next slide. And then tiny things disappear too. If you're a little bird like a redback shrike and you're dependent on feeding on the beetles that come from the cow dung, but there are no beetles left because the cow dung's been treated, or the cows have been treated with toxic chemicals to kill their own parasites, which by accident kill the beetles that feed on the dung, then you decline as well. The thorn scrub you need for your nests to rear your chicks in is ripped out. And what that means is that this little bird, the redback shrike, which used to be called in Old English the butcher bird, because it would impale the insects and the dragonflies that it caught to feed its chicks on the spikes of thorns or fences. They were common birds 40, 50 years ago, and now there's not a single pair nesting in Britain anymore. Next slide. So what are we doing about it? Okay, well, I'm changing the landscape. I've got very few big animals now. We have reseeded our meadows. They're full of wildflowers, right the way through the summer months. The big animals that are here have no toxins in them, and they wander through newly created wetlands where we've dug very many ponds and pools, where we've smashed the drains, the ditches, and enabled water to come back up to the surface so that dragonflies and their larvae can hunt the millions of tadpoles that the frogs have produced in the spring of the year. We also captive breed creatures that have gone. So this is an example of a captive breeding cage for water voles, the little rodent from Wind in the Willows. And at the front, you can see a green tray where they can wash themselves and keep their fur in good order. At the back, you can kind of see a bale of straw, which they use as a banking to make their nests in. And then all the wood bark that's around the tray is for them to build tunnels in. And every year we breed somewhere in the region of about 3,500 baby water voles, and we use them for reintroduction projects right the way through the British Isles, where there are no longer any water voles, but where the habitat remains. Next slide. And this kind of way of conserving species and it is a way of buying time when things are so threatened that there is no other prospect. I mean, this bird, this beautiful puce bird, is a pink pigeon. They come from the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and this is a bird that was reduced to next to nothing before a captive breeding project began for it. Organised by the Jersey Zoo and the Wildlife Trust International. Because it couldn't cope with introduced primates or domestic cats or rats. It's a kind of fat, silly kind of pigeon. And it was just wiped out by these introduced predators and also probably by habitat loss. So these birds were down to a handful, 30, 40 birds living in the wild. And at that point in time, a number of them were caught. Their eggs were incubated. They were kept in zoos. And gradually, slowly, wild populations have been built up. Once again, they're not out of the woods as a species yet, but it's created a much stronger resource of birds than was left when the project began. Next slide. And this animal too, I mean, this you will know perfectly well as a beaver. There are two species. There's the North American or Canadian beaver, Castor canadensis, which was all but eliminated by the fur trade 150 years ago. Whereas this guy's a European beaver or Eurasian beaver, which is called Castor feber in Latin. And the beaver is an animal that was found in Britain. We hunted into extinction maybe 150, 200 years ago. And when the beaver went, all the dynamism that beavers bring to living environments, the dams which hold back the water, which the ducks use to feed and nest on, the pools they create, which the amphibians use, and the riffles in between where you're running water that different species of dragonfly also exploit to lay their eggs. All these natural processes that come from beaver-generated habitats that are good for a very broad range of species, well, it all stops. So over the course of the last quarter century, I've been involved in bringing beavers back from Norway and Poland and Germany to reintroduce in the British countryside. When I began, there were none, and now there are maybe somewhere in the region of about 3,500 to 5,000 beavers living free in Britain. Next slide. And of course, if you're from North America or Canada, you'll be familiar with landscapes like this. But this slide is in here for people who just don't see the kind of randomness normally that beavers create. So by holding back the water, you have all these islands of sedge and rushes that creatures like the water vole can swim out to and exploit. You have trees that fall over when the root plates get damp. And when they fall over, the kingfishers can burrow into them and create a nesting ability. All sorts of things thrive in environments like this, which are untidy, but which nature adores. Next slide. And of course, they play a huge role, we now know, in regulating water. So you have beaver dam systems coming down the side of a mountain or a hill. The water is held by the dams and slowed. It takes 10 times longer for the water to pass through. If there is intensive agricultural activity around the dams, then what happens is that these act as filters, and then the silts that come through that are poisoned and toxic are held in the beaver dam. So they clean the water going downstream as well. But a lot of absolutely brilliant research that's been undertaken in North America also demonstrates very adequately that the beaver dam systems in time times of drought and summer months where it doesn't rain, actually are great natural sponges. And even though they don't release huge amounts of water, you get this slow, steady trickle, coming out of these beaver-generated landscapes, where, which if they were absent, there would be, in which if they were absent, there'd be no water at all. So beavers play a huge role in regulating water. Next slide. And they're used by sometimes surprising species. This creature is a sand lizard. We always like to think of them as a creature of heathlands and shores and dune systems next to the sea. But a few years ago, we were in Germany, and it was a bit of a dull day. And as we walked up to a beaver dam, there was one of these lizards sitting on the dam looking at us. Because it wasn't very warm, it was slow. Eventually, when we'd taken lots of good photographs, it dipped down into the water and swam away like a marine iguana into the depths. And then after a minute or two, you could see this branch bobbing up and down in the middle of the beaver dam system. And there was the lizard having climbed out, extending its body in a strobe of sunlight so it could warm up and go and hunt the insects that were also landing on the sticks. So, sometimes you see old relationships that we no longer realize were valid. And the creatures themselves, the beavers and the lizards, know how to live together. Next slide. Sometimes also things from the past that can fly come back here. This bird's a black stork. Black storks were hunted to extinction in Britain maybe 1,000 years ago because they were believed to be a bird that had an association with the devil, which is, of course, complete and utter nonsense. And people just killed them. They destroyed the habitats. They drained them. The beavers were killed, so they couldn't provide any more living space. So by the time you get to now, there are no free-living black storks in Britain anymore. Very occasionally they fly over from continental Europe, but when they look down, they see a landscape that they don't know and don't recognize, and a landscape where there are very few opportunities for them. So black storks are one of the species that we're breeding here on my farm in captivity, and the hope one day that we'll be able to produce enough young birds to take them to the wetlands of the east and release them there in the hope that one day they'll settle or find mates or migrate successfully to do so, and then hopefully return to Britain to create new generations of this once lost species. Next slide. And of course, everything we talk about, as being an issue in Britain or being an issue in North America or an issue in the rest of the world, there are so many stories of the creatures we've lost, gigantic, penguin-type seabirds like the great auk, exquisite slate blue antelope from South Africa like the bluebuck, Schomburgk's deer, aurochs, and Tasmanian tigers or thylacines. We've been killing species, as I said earlier on, for a very long time. Next slide. But sometimes, just sometimes, we get it right. Amidst the slaughter and despair and extinction curves, sometimes, and people, we always have to bear this in mind, people who do bad things are balanced by people who do good things. This is a European bison, not a North American buffalo. But the two species went through a pretty similar process of destruction at the end of the 19th century. In North America, they were killed for their hides and their meat and their bones in the end as well, and to deny the Indians a food resource that would enable them to continue the resistance against the army in the West and the plain settlers. In Europe, they were held since the time of the Romans, since Julius Caesar, in hunting parks to be kept as something that was just a pleasure of the chase for a czar or a count or a king. And these animals in modern times in Europe dwindled away to very small herds of several hundred. And then when the First World War came through, forests like Bialowice and Poland, that the last of these animals, which had been preserved by the Russian kings, were all killed. And it was only the 17 animals that were saved in European zoos, completely by accident, that ensure this remarkable creature survived. And they are a success story because 17 was where they started, in and around 1920. The bison were assembled by people like the 11th Duke of Bedford and some of the decent zookeepers there were. And slowly but surely they started to breed them together with each other. And there are now European bison worldwide, or certainly Europe-wide and Eurasian-wide. They're living in much greater numbers over a much greater range than there ever were in the time of the Caesars. Next slide. So it doesn't all have to be an unhappy ending. It depends sometimes on what you're going to do. This little animal is a wildcat. Wildcats used to be found the length and breadth of Britain. They're a species that recolonized the island after the Ice Age, and they've had a real hard time. We killed them for all sorts of different reasons. They hybridized with domestic cats, and now it's estimated that on this island in the far northwest of Scotland, maybe somewhere in the region of only 30 of them survive. But we've been breeding wildcats here on my farm in large cages. This is one of the kittens from last year. These are about as genetically pure as you can get them. And we're hoping that next year or the year after, with these cats, these 60 odd cats we now have and their progeny, will be able to begin a process of reintroduction in southern Britain, where some of the best forests are. Many of the reasons why people killed them have now passed. They're no longer a threat to subsistence peasants. We no longer want their fur. And they'll move in time into a new age of caring, where very many of the people who own land in the woodlands that they'll inhabit will be very, very pleased to see them return to these environments. Next slide. I have colleagues that have worked in the same way for some of the great birds of prey. All the eagles that are left in Britain are left in the far northwest of Scotland. But one of my friends called Roy Dennis has been reintroducing these birds that were wiped out in southern Britain to an island that sits off the southern coast of England into a body of water called the English Channel. And these great birds that stand about, as high as a dinner table and have these lovely yellow eye rings in the skin around their eyes, have now come from the Isle of Wight in the last year or two to feed on the dead deer that we leave on sky tables on our farms. As I say, it doesn't always have to end with great unhappiness and defeat and loss. Next slide. So this story could have a happy ending. At the end of it all, we're working with a range of species here that are pretty critically endangered. But to go back to the cartoons I talked to you about, when I used to visit seminars when my kids were wee, it always struck me that many of them, very simply and essentially, had a message that was clear. And you look at Moana, the saving of Nafiti, and the whole idea is that the kids that actually look to help do good. The future of this earth is not in the hands anymore of old people like me. We've done our bit and our time's finishing. The future of this earth is going to be in the hands of kids like you, and it's you that are going to make up your minds that these creatures and wonderful landscapes, which are so important not only for the joy that we derive from them. I mean, I went to Yellowstone and saw the wonder that's become. We saw wolves and grizzlies and hundreds of bison and elk swimming rivers. It was astounding. These wonders are going to be your responsibility. With all the cares that come to you in later life, you must never forget just how important these things are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Derek. That was spectacular, man. And you highlighted this for the whole second half of the talk, but it's so nice, and it's something that speaks to the Wild Hope message too that we do in this series, is that there are so many great things being done. I mean, I'm a conservationist and an evolutionary biologist by background, and I mean, there's a lot to be upset about. There's a lot of challenges happening. There's a lot of things that are getting worse. But there's also so many people like you that are making it better. I mean, bison, whales, wolves, you talked about a few of them in Yellowstone. Like, these are species that simply would not exist without the concerted effort of thousands of people over decades to bring them back. And we've helped figure these stories for years now. So it's tremendously exciting too. It's like the biggest challenges in the world ever, with the biggest push to fix them from really amazing people globally. So thank you so much for your take on all that. That's marvelous. We've already got a bevy of questions, so if you don't mind, I'll dive in with those, and we'll get underway with Q&A.
Fine.
Excellent. Well, the first, and I figured we'd get this one, is how can other farms replicate your success? Like, if someone were to get started, what would you recommend? How does someone even go about beginning, or is it just a matter of beginning?
It's really difficult because, I mean, there are trying to find the money to do the things that you need to do here to build the cages, resow the wildflower pastures, make the ponds and pools. It's expensive. I mean, it costs, just to run the place and employ the people that work here costs £70,000 a month. I couldn't do anything without my friends and colleagues that help me produce these creatures. So where does the money come from to do it? Well, it comes from a whole variety of different sources, but there is no big government pot saying, look, guys, here you are, you take this money, you bought the land, you do good. It's difficult. Um, I mean, when you come from Britain, you look at what the Fish and Game and U.S. Forest Service do. It's astounding. I mean, you've got an infrastructure that is just unlike much else you'll see in the world. I mean, the American national system of national parks is one of the finest and most civilized decisions that was made worldwide by people like Theodore Roosevelt, who was influenced his time by people like John Muir. So I mean, you really have to be incredibly grateful and appreciative of what has been done by people in the past. So if you ever get to the stage where you become a multimillionaire through some process that's hopefully semi-legal, then you just take your own money and you make it happen.
I love the way you answered that, because you actually covered several other questions that people had asked in the chat. So that was amazing. By the way, on the Theodore Roosevelt note, this is the thing. I grew up where there's a national park right down the road for me. There's many provincial parks here in Canada. And it was sort of a given. And as I got older, I learned that, wow, this was a decision of people in the past to say, look, we could make this all farmland, or we could make this more city, but we're going to protect it for the benefit of species and habitats because it's the right thing to do and because we'll all benefit. That's a remarkable idea to come upon.
And civilization, they said that. I mean, he said that, you can't build a civilization unless you start to think about the generations to come. So when you look at some of the insights and the depths of thought and consideration some of those old American presidents had, they were truly, truly remarkable men. Yeah. So, I mean, Yosemite was going to be a pig farm. That was what that valley was. Yeah, they said destined to be all the trees down, all logged, all lumbered, one gigantic pig farm. What moron ever came up with that? But the problem is that in every age, you have these people. I mean, are they evil? Actually, some of them are. There are people who are, who can only see themselves and who can only see the money that they're going to make or the power that their position is going to generate for them. But what you have to bear in mind when you're younger is money and power are nothing. Now, I don't know, you may not know, there was a very famous French president, a man called General de Gaulle, who was involved with the resistance to the Nazis in the Second World War. And he had all these profound sayings. One of the most profound I always liked was that the graveyards of the world are full of indispensable men. You can't take power and money with you. It's better to do good if you can.
That is a great quote. You talked about the people on your farm and working to dig all these things and do all these things. A simple question: how many people work on your farm? Is there a set number? Does it change in season?
I think there's about 18 of them, and I'll be frank, the best and the hardest workers are always the girls. They're insightful, they're clever, they're dedicated. They can be very rude sometimes, but at the end of the day, I have a great team of people and I enjoy working with them very much. So there are some people that work on the farm here. There are some people that work on projects off the farm. It's a real variety of different folk. There are people that work on PR. It's a team that try to make this whole thing tick over. We have conferences and festivals through the summer months. We try to do a lot of different things.
Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned the diversity of roles too, because we have a lot of ocean explorers on and space, engineers and everything else. And what we always like to harp on in these broadcasts is that if you're interested in that sort of thing, like if you want to be a conservationist, if you wanted to work on a farm with Derek, I mean, you mentioned PR, you mentioned event planning, you mentioned people that are helping raise money to make it all happen. Whatever your skill set is, if you don't want to be a person that's on the front lines replanting things, you can be involved in those other roles and still make a hugely positive difference, which I think is really exciting because, in my school, I really wanted to be a biologist and someone who talked about science and nature, but I was one of 30 in my classroom, and there are other people that want to be involved in those things, and these are many avenues to do it. So thank you for that. And 18 is our answer for our class as well. You highlighted a few species in particular that you're working on. Are there any species you'd particularly like to bring back on your farm or to the UK on the whole? Anything that you're chomping at the bit to get out there?
Well, I mean, one of the creatures I've just finished writing a book about, which was published in the spring, called Hunt for the Shadow Wolf, that we really behaved abominably badly with regard to was the wolf. And we understand now what we did. You know, the brutality that was set against them, the ignorance, the superstition, the stupidity that drove it. And the saddest thing about all our, you know, fights and the lies we told about this creature is that we took that kind of hatred with us as colonists to the Americas, to Australia, to Tasmania, the Falkland Islands, Africa, everywhere colonial feet sit the you know firm stance. We started killing wolves, and we don't really even know why we did it. It was just, you know, the first Scottish settlers that come to the Carolinas, before they get to the, you know, they start to worry about the corn for the first winter. They're out there digging pits to kill an animal that can't have any influence on the very few livestock they actually have. And so I think if we're going to come to terms with nature in Britain, one of the finest things we could do in our lifetime is say, we will make space for this creature again. Its greatest enemy in this island always has been sheep, because, of course, the sheep farmers wanted to produce their cloth and their wool, you know, for export. It was something which was hugely valuable. And if we reintroduce the wolf, it would show the world that we can come to terms with old nature that we lied about and destroyed in the past. Will we do it? It would require huge cultural change. You look at the Yellowstone wool situation, you look at the controversy that's raised. So here on an island like this, when people keep a lot of pet kangaroos and pygmy goats and zebras in their backyard, the idea you're going to have something that comes out of the forest and consumes them in the morning, not too sure that's going to go down too well.
If I knew nothing else about you than that you named a book "Hunt for the Shadow Wolf," I'd like you already. That's a remarkable and fantastic query. But I'm glad you highlighted the controversy around it, because we featured stories of reintroduced carnivores in the United States. In Europe, we're starting to see this, mainland Europe. And it's a challenge. You know, a lot of people that would otherwise be really amenable to this idea, let's bring back the wild, like bring back these creatures, say no when it's like not in my backyard, like, oh my gosh, I might have to keep my dog in at night. And it is a challenge, and there's a lot of nuance here. There's no one right answer. It's very situational and where you are and what the predator is and what the community uptake is like. But it's really, I must say, for me, like, it's really nice to see that it started, that people are willing to try and, you know, address these challenges head on. And we're starting to see success. I mean, Yellowstone is a classic example. I'm so glad you got the chance to visit that. And those sort of test cases will lay the groundwork for future reintroductions in other places. And I hope that sanity prevails and goodness prevails. And I think that the trend is on path for that being the case. So fingers crossed.
Well, all right. I hope it's one day possibly.
Yeah. Alexis wants to know, what inspired you to explore the career as farmer and conservationist? Was there a specific act? Was there a specific thing you learned that really put you on this path?
I've always been interested in other creatures, and I worked initially with cultural breeds of rare livestock, old farm livestock, things that were just dying because, I don't know, they didn't grow fast enough for the markets, or they were the wrong color. If you're looking at a sheep farming in Britain, people want white wool because it's wool you can dye. And people no longer wanted the black sheep or the brown sheep or the steel grey sheep that the Vikings raised. So in my time when I was young, I mean, these things were all just passing. They were very, very rare. Very few people kept them. And when I was 10 years old, somebody gave me a Shetland sheep, which was this little black and white thing with twisty horns, as a birthday present. And from there on in, I was hooked. So I kept more sheep of the old cultural breeds, and then cattle, and then pigs. And then eventually I ended up working in environmental education in a country park on the outskirts of Glasgow. And there they had a little zoo, which was a horrible place. It was nasty wee cages with disabled animals in it. And you look at it and think, well, this is just awful. And then my boss at the time was a very enlightened man, paid for me to go to Gerald Durrell Zoo in Jersey, which I don't know if you guys know about, but it was an internationally famous zoo where this whole idea of captive breeding animals, especially the little brown boring ones, which needed most help, until a time when the world was a better place, was really pioneered. And it became very obvious to me that in Britain there were very many species that would benefit from this approach. And it was at that point in time that I started to become involved in breeding projects for all sorts of creatures, from adders, our last poisonous snake, which is becoming increasingly rare, to shrikes, to black grouse, to water voles. So That's what I do full time now. When I say full time, it's commonly 7 days a week. But at the end of the day, like I said, it's life's a short thing. When you begin and you're young, you just bear in mind that none of us last forever. And as I said earlier on, focus on doing good. Try to do things. Don't look back. Do things that you think are right. And if you've got a real passion and something you feel is real important, you do that, because in the end, none of this is a rehearsal. And what you don't want to be doing is sitting when you're 65 or 70 with two hips that aren't working, looking back at your life and thinking, well, I wish I'd just listened to that thing that was in my head when I was a child, and not wasted my life doing something that I now bitterly regret. Do good.
Derek, I usually wrap up after the final question and say, is there a last message you want to leave us with? But that was perfect. So we're going to wrap up there. And I love the story. I love it all. I love that you mentioned Durrell too. It's really quite interesting how many conservationists have some Durrell thing in their history, whether it's visiting the zoo, whether it's learning from people affiliated with it. So I encourage our classes to look that up as well. I can't stress enough. If you want to learn more about Derek's work, Wild Hope TV, the entire YouTube channel has his story and many, many others, dozens of others featuring conservationists around the globe. We're going to be doing a bevy of those over the next 6 months, so I hope you'll tune in for that on our YouTube channel. But Derek, just thank you so much for your time, passion, expertise, all of it today. We really appreciate you joining us, and keep up the wonderful work. We look forward to hearing more in the near future. Thanks, man.
No problem. Nice to meet you.